1. My guest today is Brian Crim, who has written the book Operation Paperclip about a secret operation to bring Nazi scientists to America. And thank you, first of all, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about Paperclip.
So I also ask you in these case scenarios, what made you write a book about Operation Paperclip?
Well, I started in graduate school where I took what's called a diplomatic history seminar, and I knew theoretically about Paperclip, the idea of taking German scientists and using their expertise to perfect American defense projects, but I didn't really know the details until I started investigating what was out there as far as documents. And then starting in the late 2000s, 2009, 2010, the National Archives in the United States started to release millions of more documents relating to the exploitation of the Third Reich in the final years of the war and in the early occupation of Germany. And within that, there were hundreds of thousands of documents about Paperclip, including 1,500 foreign scientist case files that no one had ever seen before. So I started to look into those. And every time I had a chance to do some research, I went to look at those files and noticed that there's a real fascinating, complex portrait of this operation that in previous literature was not really portrayed, mostly because the documents weren't there. So I was really the first historian to get into those released documents in 2010, 2011, till the time that I wrote the book and published the book.
So how did this come out? How did Operation Paperclip become public to the and what were your and how do you feel reading through these files personally?
Yeah, personally, it's really tough. I think the problem is that Paperclip was always a sensationalized story because the people who wrote about it most were investigative journalists, and so they were out to shock people with the exceptional stories about how we had dyed-in-the-wool Nazis working in the United States, some of them actual war criminals, and there was a certain amount of that. But for the most part, these were highly educated German scientists, all of them with some sort of Nazi affiliation, or they couldn't have gotten where they were, and they were just really drones in a way. And even though I've had, of course, moral objections to the program, I found it to be far more ordinary than spectacular when you got to who really stayed for the duration, including the infamous Werner von Braun, who, while he did have an SS rank, was really just a dreamer, someone who was used his position cynically to get what he needed, both in the Third Reich and the United States. I found it to be almost shocked. What shocked me about Paperclip was not how much of it was hidden, but how much of it was actually out in the open. I mean, the United States revealed Paperclip as early as 1946, within months of it actually being approved. They tried to control the story. They brought in the reporters and said, look at this. But it wasn't a secret for very long. And that, I think, maybe is more shocking than the fact that it was the more unsavory people were hidden away for a while.
Have you met any of the scientists that actually worked on the project yourself personally for the book, or did you?
I did not meet. I spoke to relatives. There aren't many of the scientists who are still alive, but I did speak to children and grandchildren. More interestingly, I spoke to the family of one of the early German Jewish interrogators of the Paperclip scientists. You may have heard of the so-called Ritchie boys. These were German Jews who immigrants who were in the United States that wound up joining the US Army and using their skills in German and knowledge of the country to help intelligence gathering efforts during the war. And I actually came across one of these memos written by a German Jew who interrogated the Werner von Braun rocket team in June of 1945, just a month after the end of the war. And I was so fascinated by this report that I contacted the family, and they gave me this guy's diaries. His name was Walter Jessel.
What was it like reading the diary?
It was amazing. It was amazing because he was far more honest in the diary than he could be in the official report that he wrote for the Army. And he said, look, I know these people. They're venal, they're nihilistic, they're ideological, they're lying to us. Some of them know their stuff, some of them are pretending they know their stuff. He was really the first one to pull the wool, pull the let me rephrase it. He was the first one to really tell the real truth about these scientists and not look at them as magical, mystical genius figures, but to say some of them, a lot of them, are actually just out to get a job and stay out of jail. And I found that to be really refreshing. And the guy knew his stuff, and many of the things he predicted wound up being true. Uh, but the U.S. government and the scientific community was just more than happy to give everyone carte blanche and sort it out later.
So who came up with the Operation Paperclip that we should bring Nazi German Nazis to America? Nazi scientists, that is.
No, it's a combination of both the British and the Americans coinciding with the D-Day invasion. There was an understanding and knowledge that there was a very impressive German scientific establishment that they're about to overrun within months of landing on the beaches. So they created what were called T forces, or technical forces, intelligence units that were designed just for the exploitation of technology and the labs and the equipment that they know they were going to find. And they were joint American-British operations. This was the beginning of Paperclip. And both sides of this, even though they're allies, it's still rather competitive. They both realized that this is far ahead of many of the things here are farther ahead than we ever imagined. We need time with this. We can either exploit it in country, in occupied Germany, and then risk the Russians getting the same material, or we can be safe and take the best brains that we can find along with the equipment out of danger back to our home countries. So both Britain and the United States did this, except that the United States had far more resources and devoted more to this effort than the British could afford. But we should say that the French did the same thing. Russians, as you know, certainly did the same thing. But the United States got the rocket team, and that wound up being the prized possession out of all these captured scientists and labs.
Was it like a race? So it was obviously a race between Russia and or the Soviet Union at that time, and America to get the best scientists first. How did they find? How did they work? They didn't work together, obviously, but like, how did they? How did they do this?
Yeah, it was. They actually were supposed to work on it together. That was part of the original Allied agreement. But of course, secretly, everyone was doing their own thing. What I found to be ironic was that the United States was far more worried and complained far more vociferously about the French than they did the Soviet Union. The French were really just up to no good. They would kidnap scientists and push them into moving cars and do all kinds of dirty tricks just to get who they thought was the best. And then in both the United States and the Soviet Union, would complain to the Allied authority about what the French were doing. But of course, over time, the concern was dealing with the Russians. Uh, and they all operated off of something called the Ausenberg list. Werner Ausenberg was an SS adjutant I think his rank may have been lieutenant colonel, but he had the job of compiling a list of all the talented German scientists that could be used in the defense of Germany between 1942 and 1945. And the SS was gradually taking over this role of pinpointing scientists and putting them to work. Well, he knew that he had a valuable chit to play if he was ever captured. And so he handed over that list, or actually he tried to destroy it first, but it was recovered by the United States, by Polish intelligence, who gave it to the United States. And that became the basis of the so-called blacklist that all these T forces used to find scientists. The Russians had similar information, but what they couldn't find, they simply would take a big dragnet and capture as many people as possible, interrogate them, and sort out who was valuable and who wasn't, which took a lot more time and wound up being not as effective as the US, who had this very precise list of names. But everyone knew the rocket team, the V2 rocket team, was the best you could really get. And most of them wound up working for the United States.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but what made the German scientists so superior over, let's say, other countries?
Well, one of the things I learned in researching the book, and I'm not a historian of science and technology, so I relied on many who were, and they will say, first of all, that it's a myth that German scientists were the best and the brightest. It was one that was a very powerful myth that operated on the United States in particular. They called it the great German inventive mind idea, that they are somehow the best and the brightest. Well, these books and these other authors will say, well, why do we have the Manhattan Project? Why did we have these other initiatives? Why did we did not get the space because of the handful of Germans? It was because of the Jet Propulsion Lab. It was because of all these other universities and their wherewithal. But the answer to why these particular scientists were valuable in Paperclip was that they chose to devote all of their energies and their efforts into ICBMs, an early version of the intercontinental ballistic missile. And even though it made no difference to the end of the war, it still was a revolutionary breakthrough. And and what the United States and the Soviet Union got out of capturing rocket scientists in particular was basically catching up on 5 years of development in a few months. And so by 1949, you could say both sides were pretty much on the same playing field when it came to rocketry. Yeah.
So you mentioned that it came kind of public in 1946, but how hush hush was at the time this operation?
Well, in the first from the summer of 1945 until the fall of 1946, it was very hush hush because the Germans in the United States were on military bases, and many of them very remote, such as Fort Sill, Texas, White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, which is an Air Force base, or back then an Army Air Force base. But there were little packets of Germans all over the United States that were very kind of hard to hide for too long. They were in Long Island, they were in Boston, they were in Virginia, they were in Ohio, they were in Texas and New Mexico. And so eventually it was going to come out, and that's why the Army decided to break the story themselves in a very controlled way. And they sold the story as this: they are our former enemies, they are enemies, but we're going to use their brains to get some sort of intellectual reparations. They use that word. We're not going to be paid off for all the expenses we've poured into this war, but we can at least drain their minds and take what we can and go forth and conquer in a future war. What they didn't tell the American public is, and maybe they didn't even know it themselves yet, is that we're going to make these people citizens. They're not here for a few months. They're going to be here for as long as they want. That part they didn't really publicize, but it happened. By the early 1950s, 90% of the paperclip scientists were US citizens. And that was a much more difficult pill for a lot of Americans to swallow.
So we obviously had not Nazi hunters as well. And how did they find out somehow that there were Nazis working for NASA and the U.S. government? Or did they let them know? I thought they were working for us. Now they're good guys now in a way.
They did, and there were the usual critics you might rely on of paperclip that were very loud and made a lot of noise in the press. They include the NAACP. Albert Einstein himself wrote an editorial in the New York Times just going off on President Truman for paperclip. You had the American Federation of Scientists. You had the people like everyone who worked on the Manhattan Project were horrified. But when you actually did some polling in the United States, there actually is a poll that you have a Gallup poll, which is the most popular poll. And you asked Americans how they felt about paperclip. They said they didn't like it, but so 6 out of 10 Americans were against it, but they also forgot about it rather quickly. It's kind of like, well, you're against it, but you also didn't think much about it. And then by the time the Cold War has really entered the popular imagination by the late 1940s, most Americans are willing to ignore what happened to the German scientists because they're now focused on the Soviet Union. And they think there's only a handful of Germans who were formerly Nazis, so what? But if you
What?
were an American Jew, you were bothered by it, or a scientist who feels threatened by the presence, you don't like it either.
Was there a worry that that the Nazi scientists would try to bring Nazi propaganda to the American people? They try to keep it under a certain control.
There was a very real concern, and the FBI. One of the things my book does is I compare the files on these scientists that were put together by what will become the Department of Defense, and then compare it to what the FBI put together, and they couldn't be more different. The defense files are like very thin, and they don't tell you much, and they actually were changed and taken in places to cover up some of the more embarrassing information. But the FBI, even though J. Edgar Hoover, the infamous J. Edgar Hoover, was found up being in favor of Paperclip, his own agents did their job and got thick, very well researched files on their real activities, and many of them were unchastened Nazis. They were telling awful Jewish jokes out in public. They were still out there having little meetings of former, celebrating Nazi holidays, and the FBI was all over this. But it didn't. Nothing really came of it, and they kind of just assimilated. But there was for a long time, the FBI did do a thorough job of tracking this stuff down. But I should say most paperclip scientists were not that radical to begin with. The ones that were either went underground, or some of them returned to Germany as soon as they could. And a handful, and it's very true, a handful did go to places like Argentina, and where they felt more welcome. And the United States sometimes helped them get to Argentina because they were embarrassing presences in the United States. So it's it's a rich story overall.
So they weren't worried that they were trying to start a fourth Reich?
There was some. I have a whole chapter in my book about the State Department's opposition to Paperclip, because one of the things that we don't hear often about is who actually opposed this program. And the State Department, they were very worried about the continuation of a German presence abroad. Just because the Third Reich was defeated, why would you think it wouldn't come back? And they took it seriously. The military increasingly didn't fear this very much, but the State Department did. And one of their oppositions to Paperclip was, not only is it hypocritical, because we've been telling Central and South America, do not allow Germans inside of your countries to continue their work. Meanwhile, we're doing exactly that. So they said it was illegal, for one, but they also feared what they called the resurrection of an Axis center of power in a place like South America or even Central America. But they were the minority voice in the US, the new national security bureaucracy of the United States, and they were silenced. And many of the ones who were outspoken found themselves in trouble with their own bosses, and also some of them were attacked by Joseph McCarthy and the anti-communist Red Scare gang in the early 1950s, simply because they did oppose Paperclip and dared to say so. So there was opposition, but they were not ever going to win that battle in a Cold War environment.
So I want to go back in time a little bit to 1945 and the end of the war. Did the scientists of Nazi Germany realize that I could get away with this? I could join the Allies or Soviet Union? Or did they think this themselves, or did they think that I'm going to jail, I'm going to be hanged for this?
I think it was a little of all of the above, but I think once the noose was tightening around Germany, every one of these scientists took stock. And some of them willingly went into the Russian sphere of influence, because even though we have this image of the Russians being, just brutal, and they're going to take everything and force the Germans to do what they wanted, the Russians were actually very good at seducing Germans with high pay, higher standards of living. Bring your families, come work with us. We don't care what you did. And the United States had to do the same. But there was a conscious decision among the Werner von Braun rocket team that they wanted to go work on the United States side of things. And they started to travel from east to west when everything was falling apart. So Peenemünde, which is the rocket complex high up in the Baltic coast, is solidly in Soviet territory. But the rocket team boarded trains and jeeps and whatever they could to get into what they knew would be the eventual American occupation zone or British occupation zone. And that's where we found them. So everyone was aware that they could maybe sell their talents somewhere to buy time, to buy a standard of living, and maybe eventually even a second chance at a career. But for the first year or so, it was more about how do I avoid prosecution? Well, I have some knowledge here that I can sell. And that was the biggest ticket toward at least delaying any extensive denazification process.
So how did we know that they were scientists? Like, did they go door to door knocking, like, "Hey, are you a scientist? No, okay, next door," or did they just use the paper
Yeah,
that he gave them? How did
if
they
the
find the right
Ozen,
houses, to so to speak?
yeah, the blacklist were at least had names on them, but it was very hard to do exactly what you're saying. Like everyone's scattering to the four winds, and there's no half of these cities are bombed beyond recognition. So that is why you had the bulk of what they call the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps was devoted to tracking down people on their list. Some of them for prosecution, some of them the big names like Julius Streicher and all the Albert Speer. You want to go after the big guys who you're going to prosecute. But among them, they also had teams that were just searching out these scientists, and they did their job like good intelligence officers. They'd knock on houses, they'd bribe people with coffee and cigarettes. Do you know this guy? Where is he? Some of them volunteered. No, the real problem was not that they couldn't find them, but that too many people were coming up to them claiming to be valuable when in fact they were not. So it's not so much you had to hunt for people, it's that you had to distinguish between the charlatans and the people who are the real deal. And that was the case for both the United States and the Soviet Union, honestly.
So, what when they first found them, where did they had how did they manage to avoid trial in the Nuremberg trial, or any or yeah, like did they were they sent directly to America or through a secret ship or secret plane? How did they manage to avoid prosecution in the Nuremberg?
Well, this is one of the really weird parts of the story is that the U.S. government was at war with itself over this. You had certain offices in the U.S. government or in the military occupation government were about doing exactly what you said of accountability for your actions, and that includes everyone who's a party member, an SS member, and making them go through a trial. But another part of the occupation government, the army and the intelligence group are spiriting these people away so that they don't have to go through that process. And some of them do go on special ships and planes, some of them with the unpackaged V2 rockets in the same boat. They're off to the United States and no one can touch them. But most of the time, what the OMGUS, what was called the Occupation Military Government of the United States, what they would do is have every one of these scientists fill out a dossier. Then an intelligence officer would look at the dossier, which has all their affiliations. It would have, I was an SS guy, I was a member of this Nazi fraternity, I did whatever it was. If the military officer in charge would take that dossier and say, you know what, I don't think you want to admit this, and strike it out, or sometimes even change words for the Germans that you want to get your story straight. So one part of the U.S. government is coaching the Nazis to avoid prosecution from another part of the U.S. government. That was just really astonishing to see on paper, right in front of you, when you put all this paperwork of the scientists in one place. You see just how often the stories change, not because they're lying, but because some element in the US government is helping them lie
Hmm.
to get them expedited back to the United States or wherever they need to go.
So they were assigned a lawyer, or were they
No
allowed?
lawyers. Yeah. Yeah, they didn't need a lawyer. They had the um, they would go through the State Department process, but all the offending people in the State Department, the people who were opposed to paperclip, either were forced to rubber stamp the visas, whether they're a work visa or a temporary visa, or they were shuttled off to a different job, or they were fired if they opposed paperclip too openly, and off you went. So it was a smooth process for a few hundred scientists and eventually their family members as well could come along. And that was really between late 1945 and spring of 1947 that this version of paperclip was brought the lion's share of these scientists over. But the program itself changed names now and then, but eventually didn't end until 1962. I mean, long after there was a Federal Republic of Germany, we're still bringing German scientists over and luring them over here to work for us rather than their now new democratic country.
Now I want to ask, what was the difference between the scientist and what was the name of the guy? It wasn't he had a Netflix documentary. He was the butcher of.
Oh yeah, Klaus Barbie. Yes.
What was the difference between him and this? Why did he have the trial, and when they were found,
Right.
they were led away? Was it because they were valuable to the state and he was not, or was it something different?
Well, they're in some ways they're not too different because they went through the same similar processes, with a few exceptions. The paperclip scientists were not war criminals. I mean, Klaus Barbie was clearly a war criminal. Though there were the one example of a paperclip scientist who legitimately was a U.S. citizen and would not have been if he had gone through a real process was Arthur Rudolph. He was a senior NASA scientist and father of the Saturn rocket. It was discovered that he had ordered and witnessed the mass hangings of Soviet POWs working in the underground tunnels uh, of, of the V2 factories. And he had lied about it and had people help him cover it up. When that came out, the State Department, the Justice Department created in the 1970s the Office of Special Investigations to investigate people like Barbie and all these other Nazis living in America. And among them, they did find Arthur Rudolph had done such horrible things that he should either be put on trial, or the diplomatic settlement here was that he was told to go back to Germany. And so he just went back to Germany. He was removed from the United States, stripped of his citizenship, but he also got to keep all of his Social Security benefits and all the other things he got by working for the government. But someone like Barbie and many others who were valuable to American intelligence had what you might call information that was
Valuable.
they had valuable information, but it was temporary. You know, it was something that like all good intelligence, it's going to be expendable eventually. Whereas the scientists, their minds were considered valuable and their crimes not deemed as severe. So they could remain in the United States, and the ones that were truly objectionable, you could either spirit them out of America to a place like Argentina, or in the case of Rudolph, you make a big public display to say we are opposed to you, and then let him live out his life in comfort back in his home country. Barbie, though, was a real hardcore criminal who was responsible for thousands of deaths. The paperclip scientists could always say, "Well, I was part of the system," or
I was brainwashed.
Yeah, or it's a little different than I was just following orders, but not much.
Right. Okay, so they get through the process of coming to the United States. We talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but what was the next step to bring them to NASA and work for the U.S. government?
Most of these paperclip scientists, their visas were started out as 6 months work visas, and they usually were living on a U.S. base because you didn't want them out in the public, and they weren't considered citizens yet. But then, in order to this coincides with the escalation of the Cold War. 1950 is a very important year in the Cold War. It is the year that, first of all, North Korea invades South Korea, and that was a major escalation of the Cold War. There's a fear that it is just a prelude to an invasion of Europe itself. You have the McCarthy era kicking into high gear. The Soviet Union, months before this, had already tested an atomic bomb. China has been lost, quote unquote, lost to communism. Any reservations anyone had about Nazi scientists and whether we should care whether they're Nazis or not are thrown out the window by 1950. So this is a moment where you can expedite permanent status for these guys and eventually citizenship. And the Army is usually their major employer, but some of them will go to work for companies that are working with the military, like GE or Dow Chemical, you name it. This is the birth of the military industrial complex. So if they're not working for the military directly, they're allowed to work in private companies, and they take control of their status. And but how do you get to NASA is also a fascinating thing, because the rocket team is working for the Army in Huntsville, Alabama. There's a whole community of Germans living in Huntsville, Alabama. They have a whole neighborhood that everyone called Sauerkraut Hill, where all the wealthy, very well-paid civilian scientists are living in the southern mansions with African Americans workers and maids and nannies and things. I mean, it's a really bizarre scenario going on there. But when the decision is made to create NASA, that is taking them away from the Army and putting them in a civilian agency. And Dwight Eisenhower is your president here, who never really liked the Germans at all working for the United States, but he had to recognize their talent. One of the reasons he made NASA civilian was so that he could get these Germans out from under the military's thumb and make them more accountable as civilian employees of the US government. And that happened in 1959.
So what kind of work do they do for the NASA, and how do they have an effect on the moon landing at all, on the moon race to the moon?
They did, in fact, when Sputnik shocked the United States in particular, and that was October of 1957, Wernher von Braun was rather furious because he knew that we had something on the launch pad that we could do right away, and we could have been the first. And within a few months, basically by January of 1958, we have done exactly what Sputnik is anyway. This made Wernher von Braun a larger-than-life figure, and part of the success of not only the myth of how we give Germans all the credit here, but just for the legend of Wernher von Braun himself, is that he was a darling public figure. He always was a brilliant advocate for himself and for the idea of space travel. And he was young and handsome, and Disney loved him, and he had a great media presence. So he kind of smoothed out the idea of the idea of Germans working for us can seem almost normal now. And so he was like the public face of the space race. But behind that, the reality was that there was only a handful of Germans still working at NASA. They had already done what they needed to do to get ahead, which was to update us on the V2 rocket technology that bought us 5 years. What Braun is really doing is he's managing a lot of scientists, many of them American, trained in Georgia Tech and wherever else, that they're doing the work, but he's the public face of it. I think we look at the movies like The Right Stuff, or even fiction things like Hunters and whatever else is out there these days. We look at von Braun as this godlike figure, and that's mostly a result of our own mythologizing him in the press back in the late 50s and early 60s. He's a brilliant manager. That's what he did. He could take something that was a blueprint, and he could mass produce it or build it rather quickly. And that's a real talent, but it's not a an exceptional mind that we all tend to still think of him as owning. He was a great practitioner, and he managed a large team of, yes, Germans, but mostly American scientists at NASA.
How did the American scientists, you touched a little bit about this, but how did they view working side by side with Germans? Was it
Right. At first, it was really uncomfortable because not only were many of these American scientists Jewish, and that's something that a colleague of mine named Monique Laney, she wrote a book called German Rocketeers in the Heart of Dixie. But she talks about how this community of Huntsville German scientists got along with the local Jewish community, but also other Jewish scientists. That was obviously uncomfortable. But many other American scientists who didn't have that have that reason to be upset were jealous and angry at their own government for somehow elevating this group of Germans above them or even as equals when they saw what they were doing as just as valuable work. And so over time, they were blended well together, and especially by the 60s and 70s, even you saw them as citizens of the United States, and everyone kind of regarded Wernher von Braun as an American by that point. But in those early years, it was deeply uncomfortable, and they're actually isolated from one another because of that. It was only after the early 1950s that they started to become blended teams. The Russians did the same thing, by the way. They kept all their Germans in separate communities, really until the time they kicked them out of the country in 1955.
so? Can you tell me? I think we touched on the basic here, but can you tell me a little bit about meeting the families of the scientists yourself? What was their experience like? What was your experience meeting them?
Well, it's interesting because when I was doing the research, I didn't seek out the family members because one, I was writing a book about the U.S. bureaucratic process of paperclip and the story about why the decision was made. But when the book came out, many family members contacted me and were fascinated to know more about their things they didn't even know about their own, in some cases, grandfather. Many of them wanted to know if they could have access to the files that that I had about their family member, and it's interesting that I could deliver that for them, and they couldn't get it themselves. But it's usually not none of the family members were people that you would consider unsavory characters. They were just engineers. They had Nazi backgrounds in the sense that they joined a equivalent of a union that everyone had to join, or that they went to university at a time where you had to join the party. But I didn't find anyone who I felt nervous about talking to or felt really uncomfortable talking to, because they weren't the worst of the worst. They were just guys, and I should say this, they're almost all men, by the way. Maybe I think two or three were female scientists, but I found it interesting just how normal their experiences were, and how these children, many of them in their 60s and 70s now, grew up as Americans, not even fully aware of what their father usually had ever done. They didn't really talk about it. They doubled down on the idea that we're Americans now, and that's most important. That was the common thread. We are Americans, and don't ever think of us as anything else.
Thank you so much for coming in. I think we covered the basic of Operation Paperclip in this episode. And do you have anything to promote before you go? Anything you want me to put it in the description?
Yeah, I wrote a book after Our Germans, Project Paperclip, and the National Security State. I wrote a book about Holocaust imagery in science fiction and horror film and television. It's called Planet Auschwitz. It came out in 2020 with Rutgers University Press. That's available now. And I also do my own podcast with a partner, Leah Parody, called Lies Agreed Upon, where we talk about the intersection of film and history, how film and Hollywood portrays historical events, politics that go into that, the reception of film and TV about historical events. And we're working on season 2 now. So we're available probably on the same platforms that you're available on.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much for coming. My name is Alan. This has been Not Aged Well. We are available on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you can find podcasts, on YouTube, Well That Aged Well. We are also on Instagram under Well That Aged Well. Next week, we will take a look at the Battle of Stiklestad, one of Norway's most defining moments on the end of the Viking Age. My name's Alan, and I'll see you next time.